Hey guys, tonight, the gilded morning. The sun did not rise for everyone at once in London, 1905. It arrived in stages, filtered through the thick, yellow smog of the Thames, and distributed according to one's rank in the social ledger. For Arthur Penhaligon, the 4th Earl of Thornycroft, the morning began not with a sound, but with the absence of it. In the master suite of the Thornycroft mansion in Belgravia, the heavy velvet curtains, dyed a deep, regal crimson, were thick enough to swallow the screams of a revolution. The air was still. It smelled faintly of lavender, beeswax, and the lingering ghost of expensive Cuban tobacco. At precisely 7:30, the floorboards outside the door groaned with a familiar, rhythmic loyalty. The door opened with a soft click. This was the entry of James, the head valet. James did not walk, he glided. He moved across the Persian rug like a spectre, his breath held in check, his white gloves pristine. With a practiced motion, he grasped the pull cord. Swish! The Edwardian sun, pale and watery, spilled across the silk sheets. "Good morning, my lord," James whispered. The volume was calculated, loud enough to pierce the veil of sleep, yet soft enough not to startle the aristocratic nerves. "The temperature is 58 degrees. Your bath is being drawn. It is exactly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, as you prefer." Arthur stirred, his eyes fluttering open to behold the high, molded ceilings of his inheritance. His world was one of porcelain basins, silver-backed hairbrushes, and the quiet assurance that his only duty today was to exist beautifully. He did not need to reach for his clothes. They would be brought to him. He did not need to worry about his hunger. It would be satisfied by a kitchen staff of 12 working 3 floors below. To Arthur, the morning was a slow, golden unfolding of privilege. 2 miles away, in the soot-choked labyrinth of Spitalfields, the morning did not glide. It struck like a hammer. For Seelersthorne, no relation to the Earl, despite the irony of the name, the morning began at 4:15 a.m. There were no velvet curtains here. Instead, a damp piece of burlap was nailed over a cracked windowpane to keep out the miasma of the streets. The light that entered was not golden. It was a bruised grey, filtered through the smoke of 1,000 coal fires. Seelers didn't have a valet, he had the knocker-up. The long bamboo pole of the professional awakener rattled against the glass. Seelers sat up instantly, his joints popping like dry kindling. The air in the room was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp plaster, and the metallic tang of poverty. He shared this single room with 3 other men, dockworkers who snored in a symphony of exhaustion. Seelers pulled on his trousers. They were stiff with the dried mud of the London docks, the fabric worn so thin at the knees that it felt like paper. There was no bath waiting. He splashed his face with a handful of freezing water from a communal bucket in the hallway, water that tasted of lead and old pipes. "Move it, Seelers," a voice grumbled from the shadows of the floor. "You're late. The gates won't wait for a ghost." Seelers didn't reply. He couldn't afford the energy for speech. He wrapped a tattered wool scarf around his neck, a defense against the London particular, the fog that clawed at the lungs, and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. By 8:15, the contrast between the 2 Londons reached its peak. In Belgravia, Arthur Penhaligon sat at a mahogany table that could seat 40. He was alone, reading the Times. The paper had been ironed by a junior footman to ensure the ink did not smudge my lord's fingers. "The kippers are excellent this morning, James," Arthur remarked, his voice smooth and cultured. He cut into the buttery fish with a silver fork. "Tell the cook the poaching was adequate." "I shall convey your praise, my lord," James replied, standing like a statue against the sideboard. Arthur looked out the window. He saw the park, the manicured hedges, and a distant flower cellar on the corner. To him, the city was a painting, a stable, orderly masterpiece where everyone knew their place. He felt a sense of Victorian pride. The empire was at its zenith, and he was its crowning jewel. He sipped his Darjeeling tea, the steam rising in a delicate swirl, oblivious to the fact that the tea was harvested by peasants and transporting by men who would never taste it. In the East End, Seelers was standing in the chant. This was the informal labor market at the dock gates. Hundreds of men stood in the freezing mud, their shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the foreman. The foreman stood on a wooden crate, looking down at the sea of desperate faces. He held a handful of metal tickets, the tabs that guaranteed a day's work and a few shillings. You with the cap, and you, the foreman barked. Sealers pushed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. If he didn't get a ticket today, he wouldn't eat tonight. It was that simple. The math of the Edwardian poor was brutal. No work, no bread, no bread, no strength, no strength, no work. It was a circle of iron. "Hey, watch it," Sealers hissed as a larger man shoved him aside. "Get back, rat," the man spat. The foreman's eyes swept over Sealers. For a second, their gazes locked. Sealers tried to look strong. He squared his thin shoulders, hiding the cough that had been nagging his chest for weeks. The foreman flicked a brass ticket into the air. Sealers lunged. His fingers scraped against the wet cobblestones, but his hand closed around the metal. He held it to his chest like a holy relic. He had won the right to break his back for 10 hours. He would spend the day hauling heavy crates of West Indian sugar and African ivory, the very luxuries that would eventually find their way to Arthur Penhaligon's table. As the clocks of London struck 9, the Earl was being fitted for a new morning coat by a tailor from Savile Row. The silk lining felt like a cool breeze against his skin. At the same moment, Sealers was deep in the hold of a cargo ship. The air was gone, replaced by the dust of raw grain that coated his throat like sand. He swung a heavy sack onto his back, his spine groaning under the weight. Two men born in the same city, under the same king, breathing the same air. One lived in the light of the gilded morning, the other lived in the shadow of its cost. As the Earl stepped into his carriage to visit his club, and Sealers stepped into the darkness of the hold, the Edwardian day had truly begun. One was the velvet, the other was the vice, and neither knew that the world they occupied was a ticking clock, counting down to a war that would eventually bury them both in the same mud. A footman's shadow. In the great houses of Mayfair, there exists a second, invisible world, a world of stone floors, damp air, and the constant, rhythmic ticking of the master clock. While the Earl of Thornycroft slept in a bed of mahogany and silk, the machinery of his comfort was already screaming into life 40 feet below his pillow. This was the realm of the shadow people, the help who were trained to be as silent as the furniture they polished. Thomas was a first footman, a man of 24 with a back as straight as a bayonet and a face that had learned the art of the Mayfair mask. To be a footman was to be a living ornament. His uniform was a masterpiece of discomfort, a heavy navy blue coat with silver buttons bearing the Thornycroft crest, a stiff high collar that chafed his neck until it bled, and white stockings that had to be kept spotlessly, impossibly white. His day did not begin with the sun, it began with the gaslight. At 5 a.m., the downstairs was a beehive of hushed activity. The scullery maids were already on their hands and knees, scrubbing the flagstone floors with sand and vinegar. Thomas watched them as he adjusted his livery in a small, cracked mirror in the servants' hall. "Eyes up, Thomas," whispered Sarah, a housemaid who was rushing past with a heavy coal scuttle. "The butler is in a mood today. The silver wasn't to his liking last night." Thomas nodded but didn't speak. In this house, words were expensive, silence was safety. He moved to the silver pantry, a room lined with green baize where thousands of pounds worth of Thornycroft history sat in the form of forks, spoons, and epergnes. His task was to polish the George III tea service. The smell of the polishing cream was acrid. It got into the pores of his skin and stayed there. Every smudge was a sin. If a single fork bore a fingerprint when it reached the Earl's table, it wouldn't be the Earl who suffered, it would be Thomas. He worked with a frantic, silent intensity. To the world above, he was a shadow. To the world below, he was a man holding onto a job by a silver thread. By 10 a.m., the invisible work was at its peak. Thomas stood in the grand hallway. Positioned exactly 3 inches from the heavy oak door, he was waiting for the bell. The bellboard in the servants' hall was the pulse of the house, a row of 20 bells, each with a different tone, connected by wires to every room in the mansion. He did not run, servants of his rank never ran, but he moved with a swift, predatory grace. He ascended the back staircase, a narrow, winding stone passage that smelled of old damp, and emerged through a hidden door behind a tapestry in the main hall. Suddenly the world changed. The cold stone was replaced by thick, plush carpets that swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The air was warm, scented with expensive lilies and the faint aroma of the Earl's breakfast. Thomas checked his reflection in a gilded mirror one last time. He wiped the man from his face and replaced it with the servant. He entered the drawing room. The Earl was standing by the window, staring out at the rain. He didn't turn around. To the Earl, the door opening was simply a mechanical function of the house. "My lord called?" Thomas asked. His voice was a neutral, melodic baritone, devoid of opinion, devoid of personality. "The fire, Thomas," the Earl said, gesturing vaguely at the hearth. "It's flickering, fix it." "At once, my lord." Thomas knelt before the fireplace. He felt the Earl's eyes on his back, or perhaps the Earl wasn't looking at him at all, but through him. To the aristocracy, a footman was a ghost that moved furniture. Thomas carefully placed 3 lumps of coal onto the embers. He used the brass tongs with such precision that they made no sound against the grate. As he worked, his hand brushed against a small, discarded envelope on the rug. It was a letter, written on thick, cream-colored parchment. Thomas caught a glimpse of the handwriting, hurried, feminine, and desperate. "Please, Arthur, the debt is more than I can manage." Thomas didn't react. His heart hammered, but his face remained a mask of stone. He tucked the letter back under a footstool as if he had never seen it. A footman sees everything. A footman knows the master's debts, the master's mistresses, and the master's fears. But a footman has no tongue. Lunchtime was a theater of precision. Thomas and the second footman, George, stood behind the Earl and his guest, a duke with a voice like gravel. The table was a battlefield of etiquette. Every dish had to be served from the left, every glass filled from the right. Thomas held a heavy silver tray of roasted pheasant, his arm muscles screaming under the weight. He stood perfectly still for 15 minutes while the Duke told a long, boring story about a hunting trip in Scotland. And then the Duke laughed, spraying a bit of wine onto the white tablecloth. "I told the gillie to find the stag or find a new job." The Earl laughed. Thomas remained a statue. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, underneath the heavy wool of his coat. It was an itch he could not scratch, a physical torture disguised as a job. Suddenly George, the younger footman, tripped. It was a tiny stumble, a mere fraction of an inch, but the silver gravy boat in his hand tilted. A single drop of dark, rich gravy landed on the Duke's silk trouser leg. The room went silent, the air turned to ice. The Duke didn't scream, he simply looked at the spot, then looked at George. "Clumsy animal," he muttered. The Earl's face darkened. "George, leave us." George turned pale, his hands trembling as he backed out of the room. Thomas saw the look in George's eyes. It was the look of a man who knew he would be back in the slums by nightfall. One drop of gravy was all it took to destroy a life in Edwardian London. Thomas stepped forward instantly, moving to fill the gap. He took the gravy boat from the table with a hand that was as steady as a rock. He served the Duke. He refilled the wine. He did the work of 2 men, his face never betraying the fact that George was his best friend, the only person in this house who shared his bread. Midnight, the house was finally quiet. The Earl had been undressed and put to bed, his clothes brushed, his shoes treed, his jewelry locked away. Thomas sat in the servants' hall, his heavy coat finally removed. He was in his shirt sleeves, his feet throbbing with a dull, rhythmic pain. He was eating a piece of cold bread and a scrap of cheese, the leftovers of the leftovers. He looked at his hands. They were stained with silver polish and coal dust. In the world above, he was a shadow, a creature of velvet and crests. But here, in the dim light of a single candle, he was just a man. He thought about the letter he had seen on the rug. He thought about George, who was currently packing his small wooden trunk in the attic, sobbing quietly so as not to wake the butler. The rich and poor did not just live in different parts of the city, they lived in different parts of the same house. They were separated by 6 inches of floorboard, yet they were miles apart. Thomas blew out the candle. The darkness was the only place where he didn't have to be a footman. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again. Tomorrow, he would put on the mask. Tomorrow, he would be the shadow in Mayfair once more. Silk and suffrage. The year was 1906, and a new, electric tension was humming through the streets of London. It was a vibration that could be felt in the rattling of teacups in Mayfair and in the heavy, rhythmic chanting of women marching through the mud of the East End. The Edwardian summer was hot. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the bitter, metallic tang of revolution. In the drawing room of Lady Elizabeth Thornycroft, the Earl's younger sister, the atmosphere was one of calculated perfection. The walls were draped in pale blue silk, the furniture was delicate, spindly Louis XIV, and the air was cooled by the gentle, rhythmic waving of ostrich feather fans. Lady Elizabeth sat with 3 other women of her station. They were encased in the S-bend, corsets, devices of torture that pushed their bosoms forward and their hips back, creating the fashionable bird-like silhouette of the era. They looked like porcelain dolls, immobile, exquisite, and entirely powerless. "Maury T. Catherine," Elizabeth asked, her voice like the chime of a silver bell. "Thank you, dear," replied the Duchess of Marlborough, "but have you heard the news? Those creatures have attacked the Prime Minister's carriage again. They were throwing stones. Stones, Elizabeth, in broad daylight." Elizabeth's hand paused for a fraction of a second above the sugar cubes. A stone, a simple, rough piece of the earth breaking through the glass of the establishment. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of a strange, forbidden envy. "They call themselves suffragettes now," another woman whispered, leaning in as if sharing a dirty secret. "They say they want the vote. Imagine, a woman in a polling booth. We might as well ask the horses to vote on the quality of the hay." The room erupted in polite, tinkling laughter, but Elizabeth did not laugh. She looked down at her silk gloves. Beneath the expensive fabric, her fingers were stained with ink. For months, she had been secretly reading the pamphlets of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union. She had been reading the words of Emmeline Pankhurst in the dead of night, by the light of a single, trembling candle. To the world, Elizabeth was a Thornycroft, a prize to be married off to a duke. But inside, she was a prisoner in a cage of silk and etiquette. While the tea grew cold in Mayfair, the blood was running hot in Bow. In a cramped, low-ceilinged hall lit by flickering gas mantles, 300 women were gathered. There was no silk here. There was only the rough wool of shawls, the smell of damp coats, and the fierce, burning light in their eyes. Among them was Mary, a laundry maid who spent 16 hours a day with her arms plunged into boiling water and caustic soda. Her hands were red, raw, and cracked. She did not want the vote because it was a right. She wanted the vote because she was tired of her children dying of scarlet fever in tenements owned by men who never visited them. "Listen to me," a woman shouted from the small wooden stage. She was dressed in a simple, dark suit with a purple, white, and green sash across her chest. "They tell us we are too fragile for politics. They tell us our place is the home. But how can we protect our homes when we have no voice in the laws that govern them?" A roar went up from the crowd, a sound that was neither ladylike nor polite. It was the sound of 1,000 grievances finally finding a throat. Mary stood at the back, her heart thumping against her ribs. She held a small hand-painted sign that read, "Votes for Women." It wasn't just a slogan to her, it was a prayer. "Tomorrow," the speaker continued, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, "we march on Parliament. We do not go to beg. We do not go to plaid, we go to demand." Mary looked at her friend, a young girl named Rose who worked in a match factory. Rose's jaw was set. They knew what would happen. They knew the police would be waiting with batons. They knew the gentlemen in the streets would spit on them and call them harlots. But the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. The following afternoon, the two worlds collided. Lady Elizabeth was in her carriage, being driven toward Harrods for a fitting. The carriage was a bubble of luxury, lined with padded leather and smelling of roses, but as they turned onto Whitehall, the bubble burst. The carriage slowed to a crawl. Elizabeth leaned out the window and gasped. A sea of women was pouring into the street. They were walking four abreast, their sashes bright against the grey stone of the government buildings. They were chanting, a low, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat. "Drive on, Jenkins," the Earl's voice barked from beside her. He had joined her for the trip. "Drive through them, clumsy hags. They should be at their wash tubs. "Arthur, wait," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes wide. Through the crowd, she saw a girl. She was roughly Elizabeth's age, but her face was weathered by labor. It was Mary. She was holding a banner high above her head. A policeman stepped forward, his hand reaching for his truncheon. He shoved Mary, sending her stumbling into the mud, the very mud that Elizabeth's carriage wheels were currently splashing. The policeman raised his boot. "Stop," Elizabeth screamed, her hand on the carriage door. "Elizabeth, sit down," Arthur hissed, grabbing her arm. "You will not involve yourself in this filth. It is a disgrace to our name." Elizabeth looked at her brother. She saw the arrogance in his eyes, the same arrogance that governed his estates, his servants, and his sisters. She looked back at Mary, who was struggling to stand, her face smeared with the filth of the London street, yet her eyes still fixed on the Parliament towers. In that moment, the silk felt like a shroud, the privilege felt like a weight. Mary looked up, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met Elizabeth's through the glass of the carriage. They were two completely different lives, one born in a palace, one born in a slum. One was the exploiter, one was the exploited. But in that look, there was a bridge. They were both women in an Edwardian world that wanted them silent. That evening, the Thornycroft mansion was silent. Arthur was at his club, drinking brandy and complaining about the decline of public order. Elizabeth sat in her room. She had dismissed her lady's maid. She stood before her mirror and began to unlace her own corset, a task she was never supposed to do alone. As the bones of the garment loosened, she felt she could finally breathe. She walked to her desk. She took her silk scarf, the one dyed in the Thornycroft colors, and she tucked it into the back of her drawer. In its place, she pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper she had picked up from the street during the riot. It was a flyer. It was stained with mud and a single drop of blood. "Deeds, not words," it read. Elizabeth picked up her pen. She didn't write a letter to a suitor. She didn't write an invitation to a ball. She wrote a check, a significant amount from her personal allowance, addressed to the WSBU. Outside, the gaslights flickered. The Gilded Age was beginning to tarnish. The silk was tearing, and the suffrage movement was just beginning to sew a new fabric for the century to come. The tea rooms were quiet, but the streets were still echoing with the footsteps of women who refused to be shadows any longer. The cost of a shilling. In the Edwardian East End, the sun was not a celestial body. It was merely a dull copper coin that struggled to pass through the thick, acidic fog of the industrial chimneys. To the residents of Spitalfields and Whitecapel, time was not measured in hours or minutes. It was measured in pennies. Every breath had a price, every scrap of bread was a victory, and every day was a brutal mathematical equation where the answer was often hunger. Silas Thorne stood in the middle of Flower and Dean Street, his boots sinking into a mixture of horse manure, soot, and the grey slush of melting ice. He held a single shilling in his palm. To a man like the Earl of Thornycroft, a shilling was less than a thought. It was the tip given to a boy for holding a horse's reins for 30 seconds. But to Silas, this silver disc was a shield. It was the only thing standing between his family and the cold, unyielding stones of the street. "Sixpence for the rent," Silas whispered, his breath hitching in the cold air. "2 pence for coal, 3 pence for the baker. That leaves 1 penny. 1 penny, a single copper large for the extras, salt, perhaps a bit of dripping or a candle to see by. This was the microeconomy of survival. In this world, the shops didn't sell by the pound, they sold by the ha'porth, a halfpenny's worth. A halfpenny's worth of tea dust, a halfpenny's worth of bruised apples, a halfpenny's worth of hope. Silas entered the chandler's shop, a dark, cramped room that smelled of rancid fat and damp sawdust. The shopkeeper, a man whose skin was the color of old parchment, watched him with eyes that saw only debt. "Rent's gone up, Silas," the man grumbled, leaning over the counter. "The landlord says the sanitary inspectors are sniffing around. That'll be an extra penny on the room." Silas felt a cold spike of fear in his chest. "An extra penny? That's my bread, Mr. Grimes. My boy hasn't had a full meal since Tuesday." Grimes shrugged, a slow, indifferent movement. "Then tell your boy to tighten his belt. I don't make the laws, I just collect the coins. No penny, no room. The workhouse has plenty of space if you're feeling picky. The workhouse, the mere mention of the word was enough to make Silas's blood turn to ice. It was the shadow that loomed over every poor man's life. To go to the workhouse was to admit defeat. It meant being stripped of your clothes, separated from your wife and children, and worked like a beast in exchange for a bowl of watery gruel. It was a prison for the crime of being poor. Silas dropped the extra penny onto the counter. The sound of the copper hitting the wood was dull, the sound of a dream dying. He walked out with a smaller bag of coal and a loaf of bread that felt as hard as a brick. Back in the tenement, the reality of the shillings cost was visible in every corner. The room was 10 feet by 10 feet. It housed Silas, his wife Martha, and their 6-year-old son, Pip. There was one bed, one table, and one chair. The walls were damp. The wallpaper was actually layers of old newspapers used to plug the drafts. Martha was sitting by the empty hearth, her fingers moving with a blur of motion. She was matchbox making. For every gross 144 boxes, she earned 2¼ pence. She had to provide her own paste and her own string. If she worked from 5 a.m. until midnight, she could earn enough to buy a quart of milk. "Did you get the coal, Silas?" she asked, not looking up. The smell of the cheap glue was sickening, filling the small room with a chemical rot. "Less than we needed," Silas replied. He sat on the floor, his back against the damp wall. The rent took the extra. Martha's hands faltered for a second, then resumed their frantic rhythm. She didn't cry. In the East End, tears were a luxury that wasted salt. "Pip is coughing again," she whispered. "He needs the apothecary, he needs the syrup." Silas looked at his son, who was curled in a nest of rags in the corner. The boy was thin, his ribs showing through his shirt like the hull of a wrecked ship. Silas reached into his pocket. It was empty. The shilling was gone. It had been eaten by the landlord, the coalman, and the baker. "I'll go to the pawn tonight," Silas said, his voice cracking. "There's nothing left to pawn, Silas," Martha said, her voice flat. "The Sunday suit went last week. The boots went the week before. We are down to our skins." As night fell, the East End transformed. The gaslights flickered with a sickly green hue, casting long, distorted shadows against the soot-stained brickwork. This was the hour of the penny sit-up. Silas walked past a common lodging house. Through the grimy window, he saw a row of men sitting on a wooden bench. They were leaning forward, their heads resting on a rope that was stretched across the room. They had paid 1 penny to sit there for the night. They weren't allowed to lie down, that cost 2 pence. At dawn, the lodging house keeper would simply untie the rope, and the men would fall to the floor, their luxury at an end. This was the price of survival in 1905. A shilling was a king's ransom, a penny was a life, and a half-penny was the difference between a roof and the gutter. Silas stood on the corner of Commercial Road, watching the distant glow of the West End, the lights of Mayfair and Belgravia. He knew that at this very moment, the Earl of Thornycroft was probably spending 50 shillings on a single bottle of champagne. He was spending a year's worth of Silas's life on a few bubbles and a bit of glass. "One day," Silas whispered to the fog, his hands balled into fists in his empty pockets. "One day, the math will have to change." But for tonight, the math remained the same. The cost of a shilling was too high, and the price of a life was far too low. Silas turned back toward his damp room, walking slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the silver he no longer possessed. Garden parties and ghost towns. In the summer of 1907, England felt like a land divided by 2 different suns. One sun shone upon the emerald lawns of the countryside, where the air was scented with jasmine and the sound of laughter was as light as a butterfly's wing. The other sun, if it could be called that, was a pale, sickly disk obscured by the iron breath of the north, where the air was thick with the grit of coal and the sound of existence was the rhythmic, soul-crushing thud of the steam hammer. At Thornycroft Abbey, the Earl's ancestral estate in Hertfordshire, the world was a masterpiece of green. The lawns were not merely grass, they were velvet carpets, shorn to within a fraction of an inch by a small army of gardeners who worked in the shadows of the dawn. Arthur Penhaligon stood on the terrace, a glass of chilled pim in his hand. Below him, the garden party was in full bloom. It was a sea of white lace, silk parasols, and wide-brimmed hats decorated with ostrich feathers. The ladies moved like swans across the lawn, their dresses brushing against the dew-kissed clover. "A marvelous day for it, Arthur," the baronet remarked, leaning against the stone balustrade. "The empire is at peace, the weather is divine, and the strawberries are the size of plums." Arthur smiled, but his eyes wandered toward the horizon. "It is a fragile peace, Henry, but here it feels eternal." The sound of a string quartet drifted from the rose garden. The musicians, hidden behind a trellis of climbing ivy, played Mozart with a delicate, effortless grace. There was no dust here. There was no noise of machinery. There was only the clink of silver spoons against porcelain and the polite, hollow conversation of people who had never known the weight of a shovel. To be at the Abbey was to be in a ghost town of a different kind, a place where time had stopped, and the realities of the changing world were strictly forbidden at the gate. 200 miles to the north, in the borough of Coketown, the ghosts were made of soot and desperation. Here the landscape was not green, it was a bruised purple and a scorched black. The gardens of the industrial north were patches of scorched earth where not even a weed could survive the chemical rain. The air was not scented with jasmine, it was a heavy, sulphurous soup that tasted of burnt rubber and old blood. Silas Thorne had been sent here to find work in the iron foundries after the London docks had gone quiet. He stood at the edge of the borough, looking down into the valley. It looked like the mouth of hell. 100 chimneys, tall and jagged, like the teeth of a dragon, spat black smoke into a sky that hadn't seen a bird in 20 years. "Welcome to the soot box," a man muttered beside him. His skin was permanently stained grey, the cold dust etched into the very pores of his face like a macabre tattoo. "Don't breathe too deep, Londoner. The air here has teeth." Silas walked down the hill toward the tenements. These were the ghost towns, rows upon rows of identical brick boxes built so close together that a man could touch his neighbor's window without leaving his own bed. There were no string quartets here. There was only the roar of the blast furnace, a sound that vibrated in the bones and rattled the teeth. The children of Coketown didn't play on velvet lawns. They played in the clinker, the waste piles of the factories. They were small, pale creatures with hollow eyes, their lungs already beginning to harden with the black spit. To the Earl of Thornycroft, these children were statistics in a ledger. To the factory owners, they were units of labor to be used until they broke. The contrast was most brutal at the hour of 4 p.m. At Thornycroft Abbey, it was the hour of tea. The servants moved with practiced silence, laying out trays of cucumber sandwiches with the crusts removed, scones with clotted cream, and cakes glazed in delicate lemon icing. Lady Elizabeth sat under a cedar tree, reading a book of poetry. The only work being done was the gentle turning of a page. The only struggle was choosing between Darjeeling or Earl Grey. In Coketown, it was the hour of the shift change. The factory whistle screamed, a piercing, mechanical howl that could be heard for miles. 5,000 men poured out of the iron gates, their faces masks of exhaustion. They moved in a slow, shuffling tide, their boots clattering on the cobblestones. They weren't going home to tea and scones. They were going home to a bowl of thin skilly and a bed shared with 3 others. Silas was among them. His hands were blistered from the heat of the furnace. His shirt was stuck to his back with a mixture of sweat and grease. He looked at the black river that ran through the center of the town, the water thick with the chemical runoff of the dye works. "They say," Silas whispered to his companion, "that down south the grass is so green it hurts your eyes to look at it." The older man spat a glob of black phlegm into the gutter. "Aye, and they say the streets are paved with gold, but you can't eat grass, Silas, and you can't spend a dream. This is the world, the smoke and the ruin. The rest is just a story they tell to keep us quiet." As night fell, the 2 Londons and the 2 Englands remained locked in their separate spheres. At the Abbey, the lanterns were lit in the trees, glowing like fallen stars. The guests danced in the ballroom, the silk of their gowns hissing against the floor. They lived in a dream of permanence, convinced that the gilded morning would never end. In Coketown, the furnaces glowed a deep, angry red against the midnight sky. The men slept fitfully, their dreams haunted by the rhythm of the machines. The garden party and the ghost town, the velvet and the soot, they were the two halves of a broken heart. One could not exist without the other. The strawberries at the abbey were paid for by the blood in the foundries. The lace on the dresses was woven by the fingers of the children in the smoke. The Edwardian era was a bridge, and as Silas looked out at the glowing fires of the north, he knew that the bridge was beginning to creak. The contrast was too great, the tension was too high. One day, the garden would be trampled, and the ghosts of the smoke would finally find their voices. The Empire's Table. In the year 1908, London was the stomach of the world. Through its docks flowed the spices of India, the grain of Canada, and the fruits of the Caribbean. But the digestive system of the empire was profoundly broken. The nutrition of the nation was being filtered through a sieve of gold, leaving the rich in a state of perpetual gout and the poor in a state of terminal wasting. The dining room at the Thornycroft mansion was a cathedral of gluttony. The table was a 20-foot expanse of polished mahogany, so dark and deep it reflected the flickering candlelight like a black lake. At each setting, there were 7 crystal glasses and a small forest of silver cutlery. To the uninitiated, the layout was a puzzle, but to the Earl and his guests, it was the map of their superiority. Arthur Penhaligon took his seat as the first course arrived. Oysters in a chilled champagne reduction. The secret to a good oyster, the Earl remarked to the lady sitting at his right, is that it must taste of the sea, but it must never remind one of the fishermen. The guests laughed. The room was filled with the sounds of wealth, the delicate clink of silver against fine bone china, the rustle of heavy silk waistcoats, and the constant, rhythmic pouring of vintage wine. Course followed course in a dizzying parade of excess. There was consommé Olga, a clear soup flavored with sturgeon marrow, followed by filet mignons Lily, topped with foie gras and truffles. By the 5th course, the air in the room was heavy. It smelled of roasted meat, expensive perfume, and the sweet, cloying scent of hothouse grapes. The diners were no longer eating for hunger, they were eating for theater. Each bite was a performance of the empire's reach. The pepper was from Sarawak, the salt was from the Malden marshes. The pineapples were grown in the Thornycroft orangeries at a cost of £10 per fruit. 5 miles to the east, the theatre of food was a different kind of tragedy. In the frozen shadows of Spitalfields, a line of human beings stretched for 3 blocks. They stood in the breadline, a silent, shivering queue waiting for the penny soup kitchen to open its doors. There was no mahogany here. There was only the wet cobblestone and the smell of the nearby slaughterhouse. Silas Thorne stood near the front of the line, his hands buried deep in his pockets to keep them from shaking. In his mind, he wasn't thinking of 12 courses. He was thinking of one thing, the crust. Move along, a harsh voice barked from the doorway. The door opened, and a blast of steam hit the cold air. It wasn't the scent of lilies or truffles. It was the smell of skilly, a thin, grey broth made from vegetable scraps, old bones, and a handful of barley. To the men in line, it was the most beautiful smell in the world. Silas received his bowl. It was cracked, and the liquid inside was translucent. Beside it, he was given a single slice of seconds bread made from the floor sweepings of the commercial bakeries. He sat on a wooden bench, his knees touching the man next to him. There was no conversation. Hunger is a silent master. Silas dipped the bread into the broth. He ate slowly, trying to make the sensation last. He could feel the warmth traveling down his throat, a small flicker of heat against the winter of his life. 1 bowl of skilly. Total cost, half a penny. Total nutritional value, barely enough to keep the heart beating for another 10 hours. Back in Belgravia, the 10th course had arrived. Roast squab with cress salad. The Earl picked at his plate. He was full. He was beyond full. He signaled to James, the valet, who stood like a statue in the corner. "Take this away, James," Arthur sighed, gesturing to the half-eaten bird. "The meat is a trifle uninspired." "At once, my lord," James replied. The plate was carried back to the kitchen. In the world of the upstairs, leftovers were an embarrassment. The remains of the pheasant, the truffles, and the sauces were scraped into the bin. Enough food to feed the entire Spitalfields breadline for a week was discarded in a single evening, simply because the Earl's appetite had reached its limit. The clock struck midnight. At the Thornycroft mansion, the guests were moving to the library for brandy and cigars. They felt a sense of English well-being. Their bellies were distended, their spirits were high, and the world seemed solid. In Spitalfields, the soup kitchen doors were locked. The line had been cut off. 50 men were left standing in the dark, their stomachs still screaming, their hands still empty. They would sleep on the penny rope tonight, dreaming of a piece of bread that never came. The Empire's table was a long one, but the two ends of it never met. One end was buried in velvet and sauce, the other was buried in the mud and the fog. As the Earl lit his cigar, the smoke rising in expensive blue curls, he did not know that the hunger at the other end of the table was growing. It was a hunger that soup could not satisfy, a hunger for a seat at the table itself. And that hunger, Sealers knew as he shivered in the dark, was the only thing that could eventually break the mahogany. Ancestral heavy. To the outsider, the great manor houses of the Edwardian era were symbols of immortal strength. But to those who lived within their stone walls, they were often nothing more than beautiful, gilded tombs. The weight of the past was not a metaphor. It was a physical presence that lived in the damp corners of the library, the unpaid ledgers in the study, and the suffocating pressure of a bloodline that demanded perfection while the world was falling apart. Arthur Penhaligon, the Earl of Thornycroft, stood in the long gallery of his ancestral seat. Above him, the portraits of 12 generations of Penhaligons stared down with judgment. There was the first Earl, who had won the land with a sword. There was the third, who had built the East Wing with colonial gold. Every one of them looked iron-willed, certain, and immensely rich. Arthur looked at his own reflection in the darkened glass of a display case. He did not feel iron-willed. He felt like a man holding 1,000 pounds of lead while standing on a thin sheet of ice. "The roof in the West Wing is failing, my lord," the estate manager whispered from behind him. The man's voice was apologetic, yet relentless. "The lead has perished. The cost of the repair alone is more than the annual income from the tenant farms." Arthur did not turn around. "Then we shall sell the timber from the North Woods," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "The woods are already thin, my lord, and the death duties from your father's passing, they have not yet been fully settled." This was the ancestral heavy. The Thornycroft name was a diamond, but it was a diamond that was being ground into dust by the machinery of the modern age. The land, once the source of all power, was no longer enough to support the lifestyle that the name demanded. To be an earl in 1908 was to be a curator of a museum that was slowly, inevitably, going bankrupt. The pressure was not just financial, it was biological. In the morning room, Arthur's mother, the Dowager Countess, sat with a posture that suggested she had a steel rod for a spine. She was the guardian of the bloodline, the keeper of the Thornycroft standard. "You must marry the Vanderbilt girl, Arthur," she said, her needlework moving with a sharp, aggressive precision. "Her father is a man of new money, yes, but his railroads are paved with the gold we need. Your blood is ancient, but it is thin. Her blood is common, but it is rich. It is a trade as old as time." "She is a child, mother," Arthur replied, packing the room, "and I do not love her." The dowager looked up, her eyes like chips of flint. "Love is for the kitchen maids, Arthur. You are not a man, you are a title. You are the bridge between the ancestors who built this house and the descendants who must keep it. If you fail to marry well, you are not just failing yourself, you are murdering the memory of everyone hanging in that gallery." Arthur felt the walls of the room closing in. The silk wallpaper, the delicate porcelain, the ancestral silver, everything felt like it was made of lead. He was a prisoner of his own heritage. He was expected to live a life of leisure, yet his mind was a storm of interest rates, land taxes, and the terrifying realization that the gilded morning was a sunset in disguise. While Arthur struggled with the weight of his name, the below-stairs staff felt the weight of the rot. Thomas, the footman, was in the cellar, placing buckets under the leaks that the estate manager had mentioned. The water dripped with a rhythmic, mournful sound, plip, plop, plip. "The house is crying," a young scullery maid whispered, shivering in the cold damp of the basement. "The house is dying," Thomas corrected her, his voice low. He saw the cracks in the foundation that the Earl would never see. He saw the way the silver was being sold off piece by piece, replaced by clever imitations that only the servants noticed. The servants were the first to know when a dynasty was failing. They could smell the decay long before it reached the drawing room. Thomas felt a strange, dark sympathy for the Earl. They were both trapped. Thomas was trapped by his poverty, Arthur was trapped by his privilege. One had no future, the other was being crushed by his past. As Thomas emptied a bucket of grey, stagnant water, he realized that when the house finally fell, it would bury them both. Arthur returned to the long gallery late that night. He held a single candle, its flame flickering in the drafts that the Earl could no longer afford to fix. He stood before the portrait of his father. "I am trying," he whispered to the painted eyes, "but the world is moving too fast. The factories are louder than the farms. The people are angrier than they are loyal." The portrait did not answer. The ancestral heavy was a silent burden. Arthur blew out the candle. The darkness swallowed the portraits, the gallery, and the Earl. For a moment, he was free from the pressure of the bloodline, but he knew that when the sun rose, the house would demand its tribute once again. The manor was crumbling, the debt was rising, and the bridge to the future was narrow and fraught with the ghosts of 1,000 years. Machinery of hunger. In the Edwardian era, Britain was a titan of iron and steam, but the fuel that kept the titan moving was not just coal, it was human bone, sinew, and spirit. The wealth that bought the Earl his silk waistcoats and the Duchess her diamonds was forged in places where the air was fire, and the silence was a luxury that no one could afford. This was the machinery of hunger, a world where men were cheaper than the engines they tended. The London docks were the gateway to the world, but to Sealer's Thorn, they were a grey, salt-stained purgatory. The scale of the machinery was terrifying. Great hydraulic cranes, painted a rusted red, loomed over the black water like prehistoric birds of prey. Their chains clanked with a sound like thunder, lifting crates of tea, ivory, and timber that weighed more than a dozen men. "Watch the swing, Sealers," a voice screamed through the fog. Sealers lunged to the left as a 2-ton crate of sugar whistled past his head. The wood of the crate splintered against the stone quay, sending a cloud of sweet, white dust into the air. There were no safety rails here, no inspectors to check the strength of the rope. If the chain snapped, you died. If you slipped on the icy timber, you drowned. The docks didn't have employees, they had hands, and a hand was easily replaced. From the docks, the raw materials traveled north to the Black Country, the industrial heart of the nation. Here, the machinery was not just a tool, it was an atmosphere. In the Great Western Foundry, the noise was so absolute that it became a physical weight. It was a symphony of violence, the hiss of steam, the roar of the blast furnace, and the clang of iron on iron. The men who worked here didn't speak. They communicated in frantic gestures and sharp whistles. To open one's mouth was to swallow a lungful of metallic grit and oil. Sealers, now a shoveler at the furnace mouth, stood in a world of orange and black. The heat was a living thing. It peeled the skin from his forearms and turned his sweat into steam before it could even bead. "Keep it moving," the foreman roared, packing the catwalk like a prison guard. "The Empire needs the rails. The King needs his navy. Shovel, you dogs, or get out of the way." Sealers swung the heavy iron spade. Shovel, pivot, throw. The rhythm was hypnotic. Shovel, pivot, throw. He was no longer a man with a name or a family. He was a piston in the machine. He looked at the man next to him, an old worker named Elias who had lost 3 fingers to a shearing machine the year before. Elias moved with a limp, his body bent into a permanent question mark by 40 years of labor. "The machine doesn't care if you're tired, Sealers," Elias hissed during a 3-minute water break. "The machine only knows more. It eats coal, and then it eats us. When you're too slow, it spits you out and waits for the next one." The danger was not always a sudden explosion or a falling crate. Often, it was a slow, invisible rot. In the textile mills of Lancashire, the machinery of hunger took the form of the loom. Thousands of wooden shuttles flew back and forth with the speed of bullets, weaving the fine cotton that would become the gowns for the season in London. The air in the mills was kept damp and hot to prevent the thread from snapping, a climate that was perfect for the growth of the white scourge or tuberculosis. The workers, many of them women and children as young as 12, breathed in the fluff, tiny particles of cotton that coated their lungs like snow. "Don't stop the frame," a girl screamed as her thread tangled. She reached her small hand into the moving machinery to clear the snag. It was a gamble they took 100 times a day. Snap, the machine didn't stop. The girl didn't scream, she was in shock. She pulled back a hand that was missing 2 joints. A veteran weaver stepped over, tied a piece of greasy rag around the stump, and pushed the girl back toward the frame. The wealth of Britain was beautiful. It was the soft touch of a cotton shirt and the sturdy feel of a railway carriage. But the machinery that created it was a monster that demanded a daily sacrifice of blood. As the sun set over the smoking chimneys, Silas walked back to his lodging house. His ears were still ringing with the ghost of the furnace's roar. He looked at his hands. They were black with oil and red with burns. In the West End, the Earl of Thornycroft was currently admiring a new set of silver-backed hairbrushes. He marveled at the industrial progress of his nation. He spoke of British ingenuity and the triumph of the engine. To him, the machinery was a miracle that produced gold. But to Silas, the machinery was a hungry god. It fueled the wealth of the few by consuming the lives of the many. As he closed his eyes, the rhythm of the shovel still echoed in his brain. Shovel, pivot, throw, the machinery never stopped, and as long as there were hungry men, it would never run out of fuel. The season of débutantes. In the Edwardian spring, London did not belong to the politicians or the merchants, it belonged to the girls in white. This was the season, a frantic 6-month marathon of balls, garden parties, and operas. But beneath the layers of tulle, the scent of expensive lilies, and the sparkle of family tiaras, the season was not a celebration of youth. It was a cold, high-stakes cattle market, where the daughters of the elite were groomed, paraded, and ultimately traded for the survival of the great estates. Lady Elizabeth Thornycroft stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her dressing room. She was draped in 40 yards of cream silk, her waist cinched so tightly by a couturier's corset that her breath came in shallow, bird-like gasps. This was her presentation, the moment she would be brought before the king and queen and officially placed on the auction block of British aristocracy. "Stand still, Elizabeth," her mother, the Dowager Countess, snapped. The older woman was adjusting a string of pearls that had belonged to a Tudor ancestor. "Your posture is your only currency tonight. If you slouch, you suggest a lack of discipline, and a man of the Duke of Westminster's standing does not marry a girl who lacks discipline." "Is that all I am, mother?" Elizabeth whispered, her eyes fixed on her own pale reflection. "A bag of coins with a Thornycroft crest stamped on my forehead." The dowager's hand stopped. She looked at her daughter with a gaze that was entirely devoid of sentiment. "You are a link in a chain, Elizabeth. Your brother's estate is hemorrhaging money. The roof is rotting. The tenants are restless. Your marriage is the mortar that will hold the stones of this house together for another generation. Do not be selfish enough to think this is about your feelings." The venue for the evening's ball was a palace of light. Thousands of wax candles burned in crystal chandeliers, casting a golden, flickering glow over the assembly. The air was a suffocating mix of floor wax, heavy perfumes, and the ozone of high-stakes tension. To a man like the Earl of Thornycroft, this was a battlefield. Arthur stood by the punch bowl, his eyes scanning the room like a general. He watched as his sister was led onto the floor for the first waltz. He saw the way the older bachelors, men with ancient titles and even more ancient debts, watched her. They weren't looking at her smile, they were calculating the size of her dowry and the political weight of her brother's name. "She's a fine specimen, Thornycroft," a marquis remarked, leaning in with a smell of gin and old tobacco. "Excellent blood, should breed well, what's the settlement?" Arthur felt a flash of disgust, but he buried it under a practiced, polite smile. "The Thornycroft settlement is substantial, Marquis, but we are looking for a house with stability. We aren't interested in shoring up a sinking ship." The two men stood there, two predators negotiating over the life of a girl who was currently spinning in circles just 20 feet away. To the debutantes, the waltz was a dream. To the sellers, it was a balance sheet. While the waltz played in Mayfair, the consequences of the market were felt in the damp streets outside. In a small carriage house behind the mansion, Thomas the footman sat with Sarah, the housemaid. They were drinking cold tea, listening to the muffled thud of the orchestra through the thick stone walls. "She looks like an angel in that dress," Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with a painful sort of admiration. "I spent 4 hours ironing those ruffles. I felt like I was touching a cloud." "She looks like a prisoner," Thomas replied, his voice flat. "They've spent more on the flowers for tonight than we'll earn in 5 years. And for what? So they can sell her to a man twice her age who'll leave her in a country house while he spends her money in London." Sarah sighed. "At least she has a choice of masters, Thomas. We just have the one." Thomas looked at the wall. He knew the secrets of the season. He had seen the tears in the dressing rooms. He had cleaned up the shattered glass after a daughter refused a suitor. He had carried the letters of heartbreak that never reached their destination. The market was efficient, but it was brutal. It required the total surrender of the soul in exchange for the security of the name. As the sun began to rise over the Thames, the ball ended. The white silk of the debutantes' dresses was now stained at the hem with the dust of the floor and the spill of wine. Elizabeth returned to her room. She sat at her vanity and began to pull the diamond pins from her hair. One by one, they fell onto the table with a sharp, metallic clink. "I was successful, Mother," she said as the dowager entered the room. "The Duke has asked to call upon me tomorrow. The estate is safe." The dowager nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her thin lips. "You have done your duty, Elizabeth. You may sleep now." But Elizabeth did not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the coal carts begin their morning rounds in the street below. She saw a young girl, no older than herself, walking toward the markets with a basket of rags. For a moment, Elizabeth felt a strange, terrifying connection to that girl. Both were being traded for survival, one for a shilling, one for a title. The season was over for tonight. The market was closed. The elite had secured their future, and another daughter of the house had been sold into a gilded cage. As the gilded morning broke, the white dresses were put away in cedar chests, reminders of a night where hearts were the only currency that didn't matter. The commoner's courtship. In the Edwardian East End, love was not a matter of contracts, dowries, or ancestral alliances. It could not afford to be. In the shadow of the tenements, where 10 families shared a single rusted pump for water, and the air was a thick, yellow soup of coal smoke, love was a necessity of the soul. It was the only thing that didn't cost a shilling, yet it was the only thing that made the poverty bearable. Silas Thorne knew nothing of waltzes or crystal chandeliers. To him, a date was a walk along the Thames at twilight, when the mud of the riverbanks was hidden by the rising fog, and the lights of the city flickered like distant, unreachable stars. His heart belonged to Martha, a girl with eyes the color of rain and hands that were perpetually stained with the blue dye of the garment factory where she worked 14 hours a day. Their courtship did not happen in drawing rooms. It happened in the crowded, noisy, public houses, the pubs that served as the living rooms of the poor. The Blind Beggar pub was a cacophony of life. It smelled of spilled ale, sawdust, and the cheap, pungent tobacco of clay pipes. Here, the commoner's courtship was played out to the sound of a tinny piano and the roar of men arguing over the price of grain. Silas sat in a dark corner with Martha, their knees touching under the scarred wooden table. They shared a single pint of ale, because 2 pints were a luxury they couldn't justify. "I saw a dress today, Silas," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the singing of a group of sailors at the bar. "In a window on Oxford Street, it was made of lace so thin it looked like spiderwebs. I imagined wearing it just for an hour." Silas took her hand. Her skin was rough, calloused by the needle and the loom, but to him, it felt more precious than the silk Elizabeth Thornycroft wore. "You don't need spiderwebs, Martha. You're the only thing in this parish that doesn't look like it's covered in soot." Martha smiled, a rare, flickering thing that transformed her tired face. "Flattery won't pay the rent, Sealer's thorn." "No," Sealers said, his voice turning serious, "but it keeps the heart from turning to stone. In this place, if you don't love something, the fog eventually gets inside you. It fills up your lungs and your mind until you're just another ghost in a flat cap." Their engagement was not announced in the Times. It was a quiet agreement made on a Sunday afternoon while they sat on a patch of dying grass in Victoria Park. Sealers did not have a diamond ring. He had a small silver band that he had bought from a pawnshop in Whitekapel, a ring that had likely belonged to another woman who had run out of luck. "It isn't much," Sealers said, pressing the cold metal into her palm. "It's second-hand, just like us." Martha looked at the ring. In the pale, Edwardian sun, it didn't spark, it glowed with a dull, honest light. "It's perfect, Sealers, because it stayed strong even when someone else let it go. That's what we'll be the ones who stay." There was no settlement to discuss. There were no lawyers. Their only assets were a shared dream of a room with a window that opened and the strength of their backs. In the East End, marriage was a partnership of survival. It was two people huddling together against a world that didn't care if they lived or died. The wedding was held at St. Jude's, a soot-blackened church where the vicar performed marriages in batches to save on candlelight. Sealers wore his only suit. The wool was shiny at the elbows and smelled of mothballs. Martha wore a simple cotton dress she had sewn herself after midnight, her fingers aching from the extra labor. There were no flowers, no carriage, and no feast of 12 courses. After the ceremony, they walked back to their new home, a single room in a tenement that smelled of boiled cabbage and old damp. Their reception was a meat pie shared from a street stall and a bottle of ginger beer. "Are you sorry, Martha?" Sealers asked as they climbed the creaking stairs. "Sorry that there's no palace, no servants." Martha stopped on the landing. She looked at Sealers, her eyes bright in the dim gaslight of the hallway. "Servants are for people who can't take care of themselves, Sealers, and palaces are for people who are afraid of the world. We've got a roof, we've got our health, and we've got each other. That's more than the Earl has, if you ask me." Inside their room, Sealers lit a single candle. The light was small, but it pushed back the shadows of the East End. In Mayfair, the market had traded a woman for a title. In Spitalfields, a man and a woman had given themselves to each other for nothing but love. One was a transaction, the other was a triumph. As the fog rolled in off the river, wrapping the city in its cold, grey embrace, Sealers and Martha sat together in the silence. They were poor in coins, but they were the richest souls in London. Velvet shackles. In the high society mansions of 1909, freedom was a concept that stopped at the threshold of the nursery and the drawing room. For a woman of the Edwardian elite, life was not a journey, it was a choreographed performance. Every movement, every word, and every silence was governed by a code of etiquette so rigid that it felt like a suit of armor made of silk and bone. These were the velvet shackles, invisible chains that ensured a lady was never truly alone, never truly heard, and never truly free. Lady Elizabeth Thornycroft sat in her morning room, the light filtering through the lace curtains in patterns that looked like the bars of a cell. She was surrounded by beauty, gilded mirrors, delicate porcelain, and fresh-cut roses, but to Elizabeth, the beauty was a distraction. Her day was divided into a series of obligations. At 10 a.m., she had to answer correspondence, but she was only allowed to use specific shades of ink and specific styles of stationery. At 11, she had to receive visitors, but she could not speak of politics, money, or anything that might be considered unpleasant. "You look distant, Elizabeth," her mother remarked, entering the room with the soft rustle of expensive taffeta. "The Duke is arriving at 2. You must be at your most charming, and do wear the mauve silk. It highlights your fragility." "Fragility, Mother?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low. "Is that the goal, to look as though I might break if the wind blows too hard?" "For a woman of your station, yes," the Dowager replied, sitting down with the grace of a statue. "Power in our world is held by men. A woman's power lies in her grace, her silence, and her ability to provide a serene environment. Anything else is considered vulgar. The physical manifestation of the velvet shackles was the corset. Elizabeth went to her dressing room to prepare for the Duke's arrival. Her maid, Sarah, was already waiting with the S-bend corset, a device of whalebone and steel designed to thrust the chest forward and the hips back. "Tighter, Sarah," Elizabeth whispered, gripping the edge of the mahogany vanity. "Here's a pole," click. The laces groaned as they were cinched. Elizabeth felt her ribs compress, her lungs were squeezed into the upper half of her chest. She couldn't take a full breath, she couldn't bend at the waist, she couldn't sit with her back against a chair. Her body was being sculpted into a fashionable shape at the cost of her internal organs. "Does it hurt, my lady?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with a secret pity. "It's supposed to hurt, Sarah," Elizabeth replied, her face pale. "It's the price of a Thornycroft waist. If I didn't wear it, I would be loose. And in Mayfair, a loose waist is the first step toward a loose reputation." This was the irony of the Edwardian era. The commoner, Martha, was exhausted by labor, but her body was her own. She could breathe, she could run, she could shout. Elizabeth was exhausted by stillness. Her shackles were made of velvet, but they bit into the skin just as deeply as iron. When the Duke arrived, the theater began. They sat in the garden under a cedar tree. A footman stood 10 paces away, a silent witness to their privacy. They talked of the weather, the upcoming races at Ascot, and the king's health. Elizabeth felt a scream building in her throat, a raw, primal sound that wanted to shatter the porcelain teacups and tear the lace from the table. She wanted to talk about the women she had seen marching in the streets. She wanted to talk about the books of philosophy she had hidden under her mattress. She wanted to ask the Duke if he ever felt like a puppet in a play he hadn't written. "You are very quiet today, Lady Elizabeth," the Duke said, his eyes scanning her face with a possessive kind of admiration. "It is a rare quality in a modern woman. I find it comforting." "I am merely listening, Grace," Elizabeth replied, her mask perfectly in place. She realized then that the Duke didn't want a wife. He wanted a decorative object. He wanted a woman who would fill his house with grace and his nursery with airs, but who would never challenge the boundaries of his world. As the Duke's carriage pulled away, Elizabeth stood on the terrace. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the manicured lawn. She looked at her hands. They were soft, white, and useless. She had never cooked a meal, never cleaned a floor, and never earned a penny. She was a bird in a gilded cage, fed on the finest seed and kept in the most beautiful parlor, but she was a bird that had forgotten how to fly. "Velvet shackles," she whispered to the evening air. She reached for the top button of her high-collar dress, the button that felt like a thumb pressing against her windpipe. She wanted to rip it off, but she didn't. She smoothed the silk instead. She turned back toward the house, toward the dinner party, and toward the life that had been chosen for her before she was even born. In the East End, Silas and Martha were fighting for their lives, but in Mayfair, Elizabeth was fighting for her soul. And as the heavy oak doors closed behind her, the silence of the mansion felt more deafening than the roar of any factory. Iron chains. In the Edwardian mind, poverty was not viewed as a tragedy, but as a character flaw. For those whose luck had finally disintegrated, whose shillings had vanished, and whose families could no longer sustain the weight of hunger, there remained one final, terrifying destination. It was the Union Workhouse, a sprawling, soot-stained fortress of Victorian brick that served as the physical and legal entrapment of the destitute. If the elite were bound by velvet shackles, the poor were crushed by iron chains, chains of shame, labor, and the total systematic erasure of the individual. Silas Thorne stood before the heavy, iron-studded oak doors of the St. Pancras workhouse. Beside him, Martha held their son, Pip, whose breath was now a shallow, rattling whistle. They had fought for months. They had pawned their memories and sold their strength, but the math of the slums had finally defeated them. They were no longer citizens, they were paupers. The doors groaned open. The air inside did not smell of the city. It smelled of carbolic acid, boiled cabbage, and the cold, metallic scent of despair. "Name," the admissions officer barked. He sat behind a high desk, his eyes never rising to meet Sealer's. He was a man who processed souls as if they were inventory. "Sealer's Thorn, this is my wife Martha, and our boy." "Step forward," the officer commanded. "You know the rules. By entering these walls, you surrender your rights, you surrender your property, and you surrender your family." The first link in the iron chain was the separation. "No," Martha screamed, her voice echoing against the cold stone tiles. Two female wardens, dressed in stiff, grey uniforms that looked like armor, stepped forward. They pulled Pip from Martha's arms. In the workhouse, men, women, and children were segregated into different wings. To the state, a family was an inefficient unit. "Silence, woman," the warden hissed. "You are a ward of the parish now. You will see the boy on Sundays, provided your conduct is satisfactory." Sealers tried to move toward them, but a male guard blocked his path. "Don't make it harder on yourself, Thorn. You're lucky to have a roof. Many are dying in the gutters tonight." Sealers watched as they were led away. He saw the terror in Pip's eyes, the eyes of a 6-year-old who couldn't understand why his father was letting them take him. This was the iron chain, the deliberate breaking of the human heart to ensure that the poor would never choose the workhouse unless they were at the very door of death. The second link was the erasure of the self. Sealers was led to a bathing room where the water was freezing and smelled of lime. His clothes, the only things he truly owned, were taken from him. They were tied in a bundle, labeled, and placed in a vermin oven for disinfection. In their place, he was given the pauper's suit, a coarse, grey wool uniform that scratched the skin until it bled, and a pair of heavy wooden clogs. He looked in the rusted mirror. The man who had walked the docks, the man who had loved Martha under the gaslight, was gone. In his place stood inmate 402. Then came the labor. The workhouse was not a charity, it was a factory of penance. Sealers was put into the oakum room. His task was to take old, tar-soaked ropes from ships and pick them apart with his bare fingers until they were loose fibers again. The tar was thick, the hemp was sharp. After 3 hours, Sealers's fingernails were torn and his hands were stained a permanent, oily black. "Pick, pull, tear, pick, pull, tear." The room was silent. Talking was forbidden. The only sound was the heavy breathing of 50 men and the occasional thud of a guard's cane against a wooden table. The machinery of the workhouse was designed to turn men into ghosts. The third link was the legal entrapment. Under the poor law, Sealers could not leave. If he tried to climb the walls, he would be arrested for theft of parish property, the property being the clothes on his back. He was legally non-existent. He could not vote. He could not seek work. He could not even write a letter without the master's permission. At night, Sealers lay on a straw mattress that was barely 3 inches thick. The dormitory was a long, narrow hall filled with the sounds of coughing and muffled sobbing. Through a high, barred window, he could see a single sliver of the London sky. He thought of Martha, 3 floors below him, scrubbing floors until her knees were raw. He thought of Pip, in the cold nursery, being taught that his parents were a disgrace. "Iron chains," Sealers whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the dark. In Mayfair, the Earl of Thornycroft was currently reading a report on social reform. He noted with satisfaction that the workhouse system was efficient and deterred the lazy from the public purse. To the Earl, these walls were a triumph of Victorian logic. To Sealers, they were a tomb for the living. The Edwardian era was a time of progress, but for those at the bottom, the only progress was the refinement of their suffering. As Sealers closed his eyes, his fingers still twitching from the oakum, he knew that the chains were not just on his hands, they were on his future. And the key to those chains was held by a world that had forgotten he was human. The physicians divided rounds. In the London of 1909, a doctor's black bag was a passport that allowed him to cross the most guarded borders in the world. Dr. Julian Halloway was a man of science in an age of superstition, and his daily rounds were a journey between 2 different species of human suffering. To the north lay Harley Street, where the wealthy suffered from the maladies of excess. To the east lay the alleys of Bethnal Green, where the poor died from the maladies of neglect. His day was a study in the divided round, a constant, exhausting oscillation between the scent of expensive cologne and the stench of open sewers. The morning began in the West End. Dr. Holloway's carriage rolled silently over the straw-strewn streets outside a mansion in Belgravia. The straw was placed there to muffle the sound of horses' hooves, so as not to disturb the delicate nerves of the Earl of Thornycroft's sister, Lady Elizabeth. The interior of the mansion was a sanctuary of sterile luxury. Dr. Holloway climbed the marble stairs, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent hallway. In the master suite, he found Lady Elizabeth reclining on a chaise longue. The air was scented with eucalyptus and lavender. "She is suffering from the vapors, Doctor," the Dowager Countess whispered, her face tight with concern. "A faintness of the heart, a melancholy of the spirit." Holloway performed his examination. He listened to a heart that was perfectly healthy. He checked eyes that were bright and clear. The diagnosis was simple, yet he could not speak it. Elizabeth was not sick. She was bored. She was suffocating under the weight of her own idleness. "I shall prescribe a tincture of valerian and a week of complete rest," Holloway said, writing the prescription with a silver fountain pen. The medicine was a placebo, a sugar-water lie designed to soothe the conscience of the rich. For this 10-minute visit, he would be paid 3 guineas, more than a dockworker earned in a month. As the clock struck noon, the carriage crossed the invisible line at Aldgate Pump. The transformation was instantaneous. The marble disappeared, replaced by crumbling brick and leaking pipes. The silence was shattered by the roar of the tenements. Dr. Holloway stepped out of his carriage in a narrow alleyway where the London particular fog hung like a wet, grey curtain. Here, there was no straw on the street to muffle the noise. Instead, the ground was a slick, black sludge of waste and stagnant water. He climbed a staircase that groaned under his weight, the wood rotted by decades of damp. In a room no larger than a horse's stall, he found a family of 7. On a pile of rags in the corner lay a young man, a worker from the local dye works. The man's skin was a terrifying shade of blue-gray. His eyes were sunken, and his hands were clawed with cramps. "Is it the Blue Death, Doctor?" the mother asked, her voice a dry, rattling sob. Holloway knelt in the filth. He didn't need his stethoscope to know. The smell of the room, a sweet, sickly odor of dehydration and rot, told the story. It was cholera, not the vapors of the West End, but the visceral, violent reality of a disease that turned a man into a skeleton in 12 hours. "He needs clean water," Holloway said, his voice tight with a helpless anger. "He needs lime juice and salt. He needs to be moved away from the communal pump." The woman looked at him with hollow eyes. "The pump is all we have, Doctor, and the water comes from the river. There is no other choice." Holloway reached into his bag. He had no silver pens here. He had only a bottle of laudanum to dull the pain and a heavy heart. He knew that the man would be dead by sunset. The dye worker was dying because he was poor, because the city's progress had forgotten to build a sewer system for the people who built the city. By evening, Dr. Holloway returned to his own home in Marylebone. He sat in his study, the flickering firelight reflecting in his glass of sherry. He looked at his hands. That morning, they had touched the soft, silk-clad arm of a lady who was sick of her privilege. That afternoon, they had held the cold, blue hand of a man who was dying for the lack of a cup of clean water. "The divided round," he whispered to the shadows. The Edwardian era prided itself on its medicine, on its new X-ray machines, and its understanding of germs. But as Holloway watched the embers die in the grate, he realized that the greatest disease in London was not a bacteria. It was the geography of the soul. The distance between Harley Street and Bethnal Green was only 3 miles, but it was a chasm that no medicine could bridge. One side of the city was haunted by ghosts of their own making. The other was hunted by a death that lived in the water. And as the doctor closed his eyes, he could still hear the 2 sounds of London, the polite, tinkling laughter of the garden party and the low, rhythmic moaning of the alleys. The divided round was never truly over. A scandal in Spitalfields. In the London of 1909, the invisible line was more impenetrable than any stone wall. It was a border of the mind, a silent agreement that the people of the West End did not stray east of Aldgate, and the people of the East did not linger in the parks of the West. But curiosity is a persistent ghost, and for Arthur Penhaligon, the Earl of Thornycroft, the weight of his ancestral duty had finally created a hunger for the forbidden. He sought a world where he was not a title, where the air was thick with something other than lavender and lies. He sought the underworld, and in doing so, he invited a scandal that threatened to burn the very house he was sworn to protect. The night was a bruise-colored purple, thick with a fog that tasted of wet coal and ancient salt. Arthur had stepped out of his carriage 4 blocks early, dressed not in his silk-lined morning coat, but in a rough, wool pea jacket he had bought from a sailor. He felt the weight of his silver pocket watch against his ribs, a dangerous heart beating beneath his disguise. As he crossed into Spitalfields, the sounds of the city changed. The rhythmic clop-clop of carriage horses was replaced by the chaotic shouting of costermongers and the low, guttural growl of men in shadows. The gaslights here were broken, flickering like dying eyes, casting long, jagged shadows against the soot-stained brickwork. Arthur entered the Rat's Hole, a cellar pub buried 3 levels below the street. The air was a physical blow, a mix of cheap gin, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood. This was the headquarters of the London Vice, a place where the rules of the king did not apply. He sat at a grease-stained table, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He was a member of the House of Lords, yet here he was just a gent in a rough coat, a man who didn't belong. "You look lost, mate," a voice rasped from the shadows. A man stepped into the light. He was the underworld personified, a face scarred by a dozen knife fights, eyes as cold as a February river. This was Slasher Jack, a man whose name was whispered in the docks like a curse. "I'm not lost," Arthur replied, his voice sounding too cultured, too refined for the surroundings. "I'm looking for experience." Jack laughed, a dry, rattling sound that ended in a cough. "Experience? You're looking for a thrill, my lord. I can smell the Belgravia soap on you from here. You think this is a play? You think these people are actors in a theater?" Jack leaned in, his breath smelling of rot. "In this place, experience costs more than silver. It costs the skin off your back. You've crossed the line, and once you cross it, the line has a way of following you back home." The scandal broke not with a shout, but with a piece of paper. As Arthur prepared to leave, a hand reached into his pocket, not for his wallet, but for his identity. In the scuffle that followed, his silver pocket watch, engraved with the Thornycroft crest, fell to the sawdust-covered floor. The room went silent. The invisible line had been shattered. "A Thornycroft," Jack whispered, picking up the watch. He looked at Arthur with a predatory grin. The Earl himself, playing at being a commoner. What would the papers say? What would the king say about the protector of the poor drinking gin in a Spitalfields gutter? Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He wasn't afraid of the knife. He was afraid of the scandal. In the Edwardian era, a man's reputation was his only true armor. If it were known that he had frequented the vice dens of the East, his political career would be over, his sister's marriage prospects would vanish, and the ancestral heavy would finally crush the family into the mud. "Give me the watch," Arthur commanded, his voice trembling. "The watch is mine," Jack replied, tucking it into his belt. "But the secret is for sale, £300 by Friday, or the Daily Mail gets a story that will make Mayfair burn." Arthur walked back toward the West End as the sun began to rise. The gilded morning was no longer a comfort, it was a spotlight. He looked at the mansions of Park Lane, their windows reflecting the pale light like cold, judgmental eyes. He had sought the underworld to escape the boredom of his life, but he had discovered that the underworld was a mirror. It showed him the hypocrisy of his class. They lived on the labor of the East, they profited from the vice of the East, but they were terrified of being seen in the East. He reached his own front door. James, the valet, was waiting. "You look tired, my lord," James said, his voice as neutral as ever, but his eyes lingered on the rough wool of the sailor's jacket. "I am more than tired, James," Arthur whispered. "I am found out." The scandal was a ticking clock. Arthur had crossed the line and brought the darkness back with him. The The velvet shackles were now tightened by the fear of exposure, and the iron chains of the East End had finally snagged the ankle of an earl. As the heavy doors closed, Arthur knew that the underworld wasn't just a place in the East, it was the rot at the heart of the empire, and he was now a part of its design. The rising tide of labor. By the summer of 1910, the air in London had changed. It was no longer merely thick with the smell of coal and horse manure, it was heavy with the electricity of defiance. The gilded morning was facing a storm it could not ignore. For decades, the wealth of Britain had relied on the silence of the millions, but that silence was shattering. This was the rising tide of labor, the moment when the hands that built the empire folded their arms, looked up from the mud, and realized that without them, the wheels of the world would simply grind to a halt. In the West End, the fear was not of war or famine, but of a word: strike. The Earl of Thornycroft stood at his library window, watching a group of footmen from the neighboring mansion whisper in the mews. Their posture was different, less like servants, more like men. "They are refusing to load the coal wagons at the depot, Arthur," the baronet said, packing the room with a glass of brandy that shook in his hand. "The dockers, the railwaymen, the miners, they are acting in a triple alliance. If they stop, London will be dark in 48 hours. No gas, no electricity, no transport. It is the end of order." Arthur looked at his own hands, clean, soft, and powerless. "It is not the end of order, Henry," he whispered. "It is the beginning of a new one. We have lived on the edge of a volcano for a century. Did we truly think the lava would never reach the gardens?" In the East End, the tide was not a fear, it was a hope. Sealer's Thorn stood in the middle of a crowd of 10,000 men outside the gates of the London docks. The fog had lifted, replaced by a searing, honest sun. There was no slasher jack here, there were no underworld shadows. There were only workers. They wore their flat caps and their rough waistcoats, but today they wore something else, a sash of crimson red and a badge of the Dockers' Union. "Listen to me," a man shouted from the top of a dray cart. It was Ben Tillett, the firebrand leader of the movement. "They say we are the unskilled, they say we are the dregs, but look at the ships sitting empty in the Thames. Look at the warehouses filled with tea that no one can drink because we won't carry it. We don't need their titles, and we don't need their charity. We need a living wage. We need the docker's tanner, 6pence an hour for a man's life." A roar went up that shook the windows of the nearby warehouses. It was a sound Sealers had never heard before, not the moan of a funeral or the growl of a pub fight, but a synchronized shout of power. Sealers felt the man next to him grip his shoulder. It was Elias, the old foundry worker. "Do you feel it, Sealers?" Elias asked, his eyes wet with tears. "For 50 years I was a ghost. Today I am a man. If I don't work, the king doesn't eat. That is a powerful thing to know." The conflict reached its peak at Tower Hill. The government had sent in the cavalry. The wealthy had demanded that the rising tide be pushed back with iron and hoof. Arthur Penhaligon stood on a balcony overlooking the square, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the line of horses, sleek, powerful animals ridden by men in polished breastplates, and across from them, the sea of caps. "Charge!" the command echoed through the square. The horses moved, a terrifying wall of muscle and steel, but the workers did not run. They linked arms, 10 deep, 20 deep, a human wall of bone and grit. "Solidarity," Sealers screamed, his voice joining 1,000 others. "Solidarity forever." The impact was a chaos of sound, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the thud of batons, and the high, piercing whistle of the Union leaders. Sealers was shoved, his ribs aching as the weight of the crowd pressed against him. He saw a man fall, he saw a horse rear in terror, but the line held. The tide did not break. It merely absorbed the blow and pushed back. That evening, the city was unnaturally quiet. There were no carriages in the streets because the stable hands had walked out. The street lamps were dim because the gaslighters had joined the strike. In the Thornycroft mansion, the Earl sat in the dark. James, the valet, had not brought the evening tea. In fact, James had not been seen since 4 p.m. Arthur walked down to the kitchen, a place he had not visited in 10 years. He found the stove cold and the larders locked. He saw a note on the table, written in the neat, careful hand of a servant who had spent his life being invisible. "We are at the gates, my lord. We are no longer in the shadows." Arthur sat in the kitchen chair, a plain wooden seat that felt strangely honest. He realized that the gilded morning had been a delusion. The wealth of his ancestors was not a solid thing. It was a ghost held up by the hands of men like Silas and James, and now those hands had let go. The rising tide of labor was not just a strike, it was an awakening. The Edwardian era was cracking down the middle, and as Arthur sat in the darkness of his own palace, he knew that the world would never be quiet again. The fear in the hearts of the wealthy was the realization that they were not the masters of the machine, they were merely the passengers, and the drivers had finally decided to stop the engine. Gaslight glimmer. In the year 1911, London was a city of two shadows. For over a century, the British night had been governed by the gaslight glimmer, a warm, flickering, and slightly dangerous yellow haze that smelled of sulfur and coal dust. It was a romantic light for the poets, but a dim, choking light for the poor. But now, a new power was surging through the copper veins of the West End. It was electricity, a cold, silent, and terrifyingly bright force that promised to banish the night. This was the final boundary of the Edwardian age. A world where the rich lived in the constant noon of the light bulb, while the poor remained trapped in the Victorian twilight. In the Thornycroft mansion, the transition was a spectacle of engineering. For 3 weeks, the oak paneling had been pulled back, and the floorboards had been lifted to accommodate the electric wiring. The Earl stood in his grand salon, surrounded by a group of engineers in white coats. On the wall, where a brass gas sconce had once hissed, sat a small ivory switch. "Is it safe, Mr. Edison?" the Dowager Countess asked, holding a silk handkerchief to her nose as if the wires might emit a plague. "Perfectly safe, my lady," the lead engineer replied. "No flame, no smell, no soot on your ceiling. It is the light of the future." There was no flicker, there was no warm-up. In a fraction of a second, the room was bathed in a harsh, clinical brilliance that reached into every dusty corner. The diamonds on the Dowager's neck flared with a blinding white light. For the first time in history, the Thornycroft mansion had no shadows. It's rather vulgar, isn't it?" Arthur whispered, shielding his eyes. "It shows everything, every crack in the plaster, every wrinkle in the silk." This was the modern glimmer. It was a light that didn't just illuminate, it exposed. It was a luxury that cost more in a month than a commoner earned in a year, a literal, gilded light that separated those who could afford the future from those who were stuck in the past. 2 miles away, in the tenements of White-Capel, the future was a rumor that had no meaning. Silas Thorne sat in his room, watching the final tremors of a dying candle. In the East End, the night was still a physical wall. There were no ivory switches here. There were only the lucifer, matches, and the steady, rhythmic hiss of the communal gas jet in the hallway, a light that flickered whenever the wind caught the chimney. The gaslight was a living thing. It breathed, it sighed, and it left a thin, black film of soot on the lungs of everyone who lived by it. "They say the West End is as bright as day at midnight," Martha said, her voice a shadow in the dim room. She was trying to sew a button by the light of the hall jet, her eyes squinting against the gloom. "Let them have their wires," Silas grumbled. "The sun is free, and the dark is honest. A man can hide his poverty in the gaslight, Martha, but in that new light, you can see the hunger in the marrow of your bones." Silas walked to the window. He could see the distant, electric glow of Piccadilly Circus reflecting off the low clouds. It looked like a forest fire on the horizon. To him, that glow was a warning. It was the sound of a world moving faster than he could run. The electricity was the machinery of hunger in a new form, a technology that would automate the factories and leave the hands with nothing but their shadows. The divide was most visible in the streets. The lamplighter, a man with a long pole and a rhythmic walk, was a fading ghost. In the West End, his job was being replaced by the electrician and the automatic timer. But in the East, the lamplighter was still a king. He was the one who brought the light and the one who took it away. One evening, Arthur Penhaligon decided to walk from his club to the outskirts of the city. He moved from the electric brilliance of the Ritz, where the light was so strong it made the pavement sparkle like silver, into the gaslight glimmer of the docks. The transition felt like stepping back 100 years. The air grew colder, the smells of the river became more pungent. Without the electric glare, the city felt ancient again. He saw the faces of the people in the shadows, the flower sellers, the match girls, the penny sit-ups. He realized that the modern world was a thin veneer. It was a layer of copper and glass draped over a sea of Victorian misery. The electricity didn't solve the poverty, it just made it harder for the rich to see it when they were in their own parlors. It created a sightless wealth, a world where you could live in a circle of light and pretend the darkness didn't exist. The light vanished, and for a moment he was blind. In the total darkness, he felt a sudden, terrifying equality with Sealer's Thorn. Without the switch, he was just a man in the dark, breathing the same air, waiting for the same dawn. "The light is a lie," he whispered to the silence. The Edwardian era was a transition, a bridge of gaslight leading to an electric future. But as the glimmer faded and the modern took hold, the chasm between the two Londons had never been wider. One was powered by the lightning, the other was still struggling to find a match. And as the city slept, the wires hummed with a power that no one truly understood, a power that was preparing the world for a light far more violent than any bulb. A Sunday of two halves. In the London of 1911, Sunday was the only day when the gears of the empire ceased their grinding. For 24 hours, the factories fell silent, the docks were still, and the machinery of hunger took a jagged, uneven breath. But the silence was not a peace, it was a division. This was a Sunday of two halves, a day where the incense of Westminster Abbey rose to the heavens alongside the desperate, soot-stained prayers of the East End. One was a ceremony of status, the other was a cry for survival. Both reached for the same God, but they did so from opposite ends of the social universe. The morning began in the West End with the Parade of Piety. At Westminster Abbey, the bells rang out in a glorious bronze symphony that could be heard across the river. The air was crisp, and the sun hit the Gothic spires with a golden light that seemed to bless the very stones. Arthur Penhaligon walked toward the great doors, his sister Elizabeth at his side. They were dressed in their Sunday best, which, for the Thornycrofts, meant silk top hats and tailored wool coats that cost more than a parish priest's annual salary. The entrance to the abbey was a theater of recognition. Every nod, every tip of the hat was a confirmation of rank. Inside, the air was a cold, holy weight, scented with ancient dust and expensive beeswax. As the organ began to roar, a sound that felt like the voice of the empire itself, Arthur sat in his family's private pew. It was padded with crimson velvet and bore a silver plaque with his ancestor's name. "Almighty and most merciful Father," the dean began, his voice a cultured, melodic baritone, "we have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep." Arthur looked up at the stained glass. The light was broken into 1,000 jewels, sapphire, emerald, and ruby. Here God was a king, a majestic, orderly figure who sat at the head of a celestial table. The prayers were not requests, they were affirmations. They thanked God for the stability of the realm, for the health of the king, and for the natural order that placed the Thornycrofts in the velvet pews and the commoners in the street. To Arthur, the service was a comfort, a spiritual insurance policy that guaranteed the gilded morning would continue into eternity. 2 miles away, in a derelict basement mission in Shoreditch, the second half of Sunday was unfolding. There were no organs here, no velvet pews, and no stained glass. The Abbey of the Poor was a room with damp-stained walls and a single wooden cross made from 2 pieces of a shipping crate. The air didn't smell of incense. It smelled of unwashed wool, cheap gin, and the metallic tang of illness. Sealer's Thorn sat on a backless wooden bench, his head bowed. Beside him, Martha held a tattered prayer book, its pages yellowed by the fog. The vicar was a man in a frayed black coat who spent his nights in the workhouse infirmaries. He didn't speak of natural order. He spoke of a carpenter who was homeless and a God who looked for the lost in the mud. "Give us this day our daily bread," The congregation whispered. In the abbey, this line was a formality, a traditional phrase spoken by people whose larders were overflowing, but in the Shoreditch mission, it was a literal, desperate demand. When Silas said daily bread, he was picturing a crust of rye. He was picturing the halfpenny he needed for his son's milk. The prayer was not a ceremony, it was a negotiation with the divine for another 24 hours of life. "O Lord," a woman cried out from the front row, her voice cracking with grief. How long must the children go cold? How long must the water be poison?" The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. This was the prayer that never reached the abbey, the prayer of the destitute. It was a raw, bleeding thing that didn't care about liturgy or Latin. It was the sound of a people who were tired of being lost sheep and were starting to wonder why the shepherd lived in a palace while they died in the pen. The divide reached its peak at the conclusion of the services. Outside Westminster Abbey, the church parade began. The wealthy strolled through St. James's Park, showing off their fashion and their carriages. It was the social event of the week, a time to be seen and to see. Arthur tipped his hat to a duchess, his mind already drifting to the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding that awaited him at home. To him, Sunday was a rest. Outside the Shoreditch mission, there was no parade. There was only the breadline. Because it was Sunday, the factories were closed, which meant there was no pay. For the casual laborer, a day of rest was a day of starvation. Silas stood in the mud, waiting for a bowl of watery turnip soup provided by the mission. He looked toward the west, where the distant towers of the abbey stood against the grey sky. He could hear the faint, ghostly echo of the bells. "They're praying to the same one we are, aren't they, Silas?" Martha asked, her hand trembling as she took her bowl. "Maybe," Silas replied, his eyes hard. "But I think the wires are crossed, Martha. Their God lives in the gold, and ours lives in the dirt, and I don't think they've spoken to each other in a very long time." As the sun set on the Sunday of two halves, London returned to its shadows. In the Thornycroft mansion, the candles were lit, and the family gathered for a lavish dinner. They felt right with the world. Their duty to God was done, their status was confirmed, and their bellies were full. In the tenements, the mission soup was gone. The people huddled together for warmth, waiting for the Monday morning whistle, the sound that would end the rest and restart the machinery of hunger. The Edwardian Sunday was a mirror of the era itself, a beautiful holy mask covering a face of agonizing want. One half of London was saved by grace, the other was surviving by grit. And as the bells of the abbey finally fell silent, the city held its breath, 2 Londons, 2 gods, and one inevitable breaking point. The ruin of reputation. In the London of 1912, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered, and yet it was a currency that was distributed with a cruel systemic bias. For the aristocracy, reputation was a glass tower, magnificent to behold, but capable of shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces with a single misplaced word. For the poor, however, reputation was a luxury they could never afford to own. This was the ruin of reputation, a world where a lady could lose her entire life over a cup of tea with the wrong man, while a poor man was already considered ruined by the very nature of his birth. Lady Elizabeth Thornycroft stood in the center of her bedroom, her hands trembling so violently that the lace on her sleeves rattled like dry leaves. On the mahogany vanity lay a single, crumpled note, the letter from the WSBU, the suffragettes, thanking her for her clandestine support. If this paper were to be seen by the Duke, if it were to be whispered about in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, Elizabeth would not just be embarrassed, she would be erased. "Is it true, Elizabeth?" the Dowager Countess asked, her voice coming from the doorway like a strike of cold iron. She held a second piece of paper, a gossip column from the Tatler that mentioned a lady of high standing seen near a radical meeting in Bow. I only wanted to help, Mother," Elizabeth whispered, her mask finally falling away to reveal a face of raw terror. "Help," the Dowager hissed, closing the door with a sharp click. "You have not helped. You have committed social suicide. In our world, a woman has no physical strength. She has only her name. Without your name, you are a ghost. The Duke will withdraw his offer. The Thornycroft credit will be cancelled by the banks. You will be cut from every guest list in London. You will be dead while your heart is still beating. This was the Edwardian execution. There was no blood, no gallows, and no screams. There was only a cold, polite silence. A woman's reputation was a thin thread holding up a massive chandelier, and Elizabeth had just set the thread on fire. 2 miles away, in a gutter outside a gin palace in Shoreditch, Sealer's Thorn was being hauled to his feet by a policeman's truncheon. Sealer's was covered in the filth of the street. His eye was swollen shut from a fight over a piece of scrap metal. His clothes were rags, and his breath smelled of the cheap, industrial, rot-gut gin he had used to numb the pain in his broken ribs. "Look at this one," the policeman sneered, shoving Sealer's against the soot-stained wall. "A right thorn in the side of the law, aren't you? What will your reputation be after a night in the cells, eh?" Sealer's looked at the officer and laughed, a wet rattling sound that ended in a spray of blood. "Reputation? You can't ruin a man who's already buried copper. I'm a docker without a dock, a father without a home, and a man without a shilling. Go ahead. Tell the world Sealer's Thorn is a drunk and a thief. It won't change the price of bread, and it won't change the way the world looks at me." For Sealer's, the ruin had happened generations ago. He was born with a bad character because he was born in a slum. He didn't have to worry about a gossip column or a misplaced letter. He lived in a world where the only reputation that mattered was the one written on a police blotter or a workhouse ledger. He was free, not because he was powerful, but because he was already at the bottom. The policeman couldn't take his standing because he had no ground to stand on. The contrast was completed at 4 p.m., the hour of the cut. In Mayfair, Elizabeth sat in her carriage, driven by a footman who would not look her in the eye. As she passed the Duchess of Devonshire on Piccadilly, Elizabeth raised her hand in a small, hopeful wave. The Duchess looked directly at Elizabeth. Her eyes were as cold and blank as marble. She did not nod. She did not smile. She simply looked through Elizabeth as if the girl were made of glass. Elizabeth felt a physical pain in her chest, a sensation of being erased from existence. By tomorrow, her invitations would be returned unopened. By next week, her name would be a warning whispered to other debutantes. She had lost her name, and in doing so, she had lost her world. That same hour, Sealer's walked back into the chant at the docks. The foreman looked at Sealer's bruised face and his torn coat. "Back again, Thorn. I heard you were in the cells last night." "I was," Sealer's said, standing straight despite the pain. "You want me to work, or you want to talk about my social standing?" The foreman shrugged. "I don't care if you murdered the king, as long as you can lift a 100-weight sack. Get to the hold." Sealer's moved. He had no shame, because shame requires a pedestal to fall from. He had his strength, and he had his hunger. In the East End, the only ruin was death. Everything else was just another day in the smoke. As the sun set, the two Londons remained divided by the currency of the name. In the Thornycroft mansion, Elizabeth lay in the dark, weeping for a life that was over before it had begun. She was a lady no more, she was a scandal. In the tenement, Sealer's sat with Martha, sharing a piece of salted fish. He was a pauper, a drunk, and a criminal, but he was alive, and he was with the only people who knew his true name. The Edwardian era was a house of cards, and reputation was the wind. As the year 1912 began to fade into the shadows of history, the ruin was spreading. The elite were discovering that their glass towers were fragile, while the poor were discovering that having nothing to lose was the greatest power of all. And as the bells of Big Ben struck midnight, the name of Thornycroft felt like a heavy stone, while the name of Sealer's Thorn felt like a fist.